welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 43. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the author of A Beautiful Spy. Hello, Rachel Hore.
Hello, it's very nice to meet you.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you very much. Just, working from home like everybody else.
I'll ask you a question before we get to your book, because it's something I have to ask. You were an editor at HarperCollins before you became an author yourself. How did that influence your writing?
It gave me years of experience of talking to other authors about their work, learning the language and how fiction is put together, the importance of voice, and a great deal of information about place and historical setting and character and dialogue and so forth. So it was in some ways a rather strange creative writing course to have been a fiction editor. But when you actually come to do it yourself, of course, it's a whole different matter. And I still faced the challenges that every other new writer faces in trying to write fiction for the first time. It's like riding a bicycle, really. You might know the theory of it all, but until you actually do it, you can't actually know what it feels like.
I'll have to ask that question. I think it's relevant here.
Yeah.
Did you always know that you wanted to write a book? Had you always had a book in you?
No. I didn't dare think I could be a writer. Although I'd been good at what was known as composition back in my school days, I knew jolly well that all the poetry and short stories and so forth that I'd tried to write were not very good at all. So it wasn't something that I considered as a possible career move for me. And I very much enjoyed publishing other people's books. So I wasn't at that point a writer manqué. That came after I left my job in publishing and, I don't know, had a bit of space to think about what I wanted to do and why. And I suppose I started writing shortly after the sudden death of my father, and I wasn't writing about his death, but somehow sitting down and writing things down generally was something that was very helpful to me. And I also started looking at the world in a different way and was trying to write some short stories, really, about particular feelings I had. I think about getting older and family and that sort of thing. And I tried to write short stories for the women's magazine market, but they wouldn't stay being stories. They got longer and longer, these pieces I was writing. And in the end, I took the jump to trying a novel first of all. Fortunately, it seemed to work out after a lot of messing about, trying different things. And then I had the experience eventually of being edited myself, which was actually quite an enjoyable experience to be at the other end of the process.
Well, you mentioned your father there, and I'm sorry to hear about him passing.
Thank you.
Was he an inspiration to you?
Not in the way of writing or my job or anything like that, but he was a very solid presence in my life. He was quite a quiet, reserved person, but he had always been there, as your parents are, supporting you emotionally, sometimes financially. And he died very suddenly, and I'd had no chance to say goodbye to him. And so, the process of grief was a very strange one. I know grief generally is not a straightforward thing, but I had moved away from London, where I'd lived quite close to my parents. I'd moved away from London to Norwich, where we are now, because my husband came from here, and we'd decided just to move somewhere to have perhaps a better quality of life for the children and be closer to their cousins and so on. So I felt quite guilty about having left my parents behind, essentially. And when he died suddenly, about a year later, it made me feel I'd done the wrong thing in moving away. So there were all sorts of feelings to process at that time. and two, about the whole business of having left a career that I'd really enjoyed, made the choice of spending much more time with my family, as the politicians say. And I wanted to write about some of those feelings as well. And those were feelings that came into the first book I wrote, The Dream House, which was about a young woman who had done likewise, who had moved her family from the city to the coast in search of a better life. And a lot of first novels are semi-autobiographical, and I certainly found myself writing about some of the feelings that I had in my character of Kate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't read that book, but I've read Beautiful Spy, obviously, for this podcast. But you can kind of see some of the emotions maybe that are still being brought into your writing, which is lovely.
Interesting, yes.
Yeah. Obviously, they come from sad beginnings, but used in an interesting way. So if we say, I'll give a quick roundup of the book, then we can move on into your reading. So A Beautiful Spy tells the story of the compelling career years of Minnie Gray. As she reached adulthood in the 1920s, she knew she wanted more in all the contexts of the time. She's approached by a young woman in her family circle of acquaintances who hints that she might be a good candidate to help her country. And after a while, she's contacted by Max Knight from MI5 to spy for the government on Soviet sympathisers and the Communist Party members in London. So there's going to be danger there, and as you might say, there be dragons, effectively. So, Rachel, shall we start with your reading?
Yes. I'm going to read from a piece set in 1931, near the beginning of the book, where Minnie has been invited to start a training process with Max, number 38 Sloane Street, Knightsbridge. When she rang the bell, a dog started yapping within. After a moment, the door opened a crack, and Captain King, that's the nickname of Max, Captain King's good-natured face appeared, his hand on the collar of a small brown wide-haired terrier. Oh, sorry, he scooped up the animal, then opened the door wider. Come in quickly, or the parrot will escape. The parrot? What kind of place was this? Clutching her overnight case, Minnie stepped across the threshold. You found it easily enough. He closed the door, then set the struggling dog on the floor, whereupon it dashed to sniff at her as the captain took her coat. Sensing she was friend and not foe, the animal lost interest and trotted away down a dimly lit hallway that was piled on either side with boxes, bags, and packages. Follow Bobby, the captain instructed. Apologies for the mess, but I've only recently moved in. Minnie found herself in a large, high-ceilinged drawing room with a view of the street below. It smelt strongly of sawdust. Mind the snake? The captain's voice came right from behind. He can be bad-tempered if he's jolted. She drew a sharp breath and took care to avoid a glass vivarium on the floor. Its inside had been artfully laid out as a desert landscape, with sand, rocks, and a cave-like structure made out of papier-mâché. But its inhabitant must have been snoozing out of sight because there was no sign of life. A low electric hum drew Minnie's attention to a pair of aquariums on stands against the far wall. Fascinated, she wandered across to one and stared at the shoal of bright orange fish darting about in the bubbling water. A sudden squawk from the direction of the window alerted her to a blue-breasted parrot swinging on a perch. It cocked its head at her with half-shuttered eyes, then gave a suggestive whistle that made her flinch before it flapped its wings and sailed off round the room. She cried out as it narrowly avoided her head. I apologise for the bird. I brought him from an old sailor who taught him no manners, the captain said ruefully. You look rattled. I simply didn't expect all this. Minnie swept her hand to encompass the fish, the parrot, the row of feeding bowls on newspaper on the floor, and a cage sitting on a shelf between stacks of books, where a gold-coloured mouse had begun to scamper on a rattling wheel. Bobby the dog, meanwhile, sat in the middle of the patterned rug, his shining eyes fixed on her beseechingly from under his shaggy fringe. Ah, the menagerie. My sister, who owns this flat, is not best pleased by the mess. The captain shifted a sack of sunflower seed from one of a pair of shabby armchairs, plumped up a cushion, and bade Minnie sit down. Then off he went to brew coffee. There was no wife or maid to do it for him, it seemed. That meant she was alone with him. Surely she wasn't to receive her training here. Her nervousness grew. When the captain had invited her for the weekend, she had never imagined the Knightsbridge address to be his home. Perhaps after coffee he would summon a taxi to take them to some offices or a country house training centre. And where was she to stay tonight, she'd like to know? Surely not here with him, that would be improper. After he returned with a tray, poured the coffee and settled himself in the opposite armchair with a sheaf of papers, she plucked up the courage to ask, "Will we be here all the time?" He shot her a guarded look. "I thought so, yes. Do you mind? My secretary's booked you into a hotel up the road, so you'll be quite safe." "Oh, I didn't mean to imply," she blurted in embarrassment. "It's simply that I expected somewhere more official with other people. Do you really work from here?" "Ah," the captain sank back in his chair with a smile. "You imagined dark-panelled rooms, the smell of old leather, and a hushed atmosphere like a spy thriller. No, I'm afraid there is some distance between fiction and reality." He paused to toss Bobby a piece of shortbread. "The office is not far away in South Kensington, but it's too communal for me, like a school staff room, frankly, and it's not easy to conduct classified business. My secretary's there, but personally I like to keep my activities separate from everybody else's. It's the way I work best." "Oh, I see," she said, a little bit dismal. So she wasn't to feel part of something big and important after all. How little she'd grasped of her situation. Minnie began to fear that she had taken too much on trust. But now this odd man was regarding her most sympathetically, with that alarming reassurance of his. So she cradled her warm coffee mug and admitted, I still don't understand. Can you tell me more about what I'll be doing?" He brushed crumbs from his papers, and his expression became grave. "I'm sorry, Miss Gray, I haven't been fair, and you've been most patient. I'll begin by explaining that you will be working for M Section, part of British intelligence." Minnie's eyes widened. "I assumed it to be British intelligence, but M Section, what is that?" "Actually," he said, looking a little smug, "it's me. I am M. M for Maxwell. And here, 38 Sloane Street," he waved his hand. "Welcome to M Section HQ."
So there are lots of real historical people in this book, but one in particular. Can you tell us, maybe broadly or however much detail you want to give, this book is based on Olga Gray?
Yes. Olga Gray was a real-life spy, and I have based the novel quite closely on her, but partly for creative reasons and partly to emphasise that it is a novel, ultimately. Novels have their own rules, rather than a piece of meticulously accurate non-fiction. I have given Olga the fictional name of Minnie, but many of the characters in the book are real. Maxwell Knight was definitely real. He was a very famous spy handler, not at the time, but looking back afterwards, on whom the character of M in James Bond is founded. And he was a spy handler for MI5 from the late 1920s until the Second World War period. And he ran spies that followed operations of both extreme right and extreme left parties in that period. Other characters include members of Olga's family, the numbers of which I had to simplify slightly for reasons of not wanting to overwhelm the novel. And I have more or less invented Raymond, who is an ex-boyfriend of Olga's, who appears at the beginning of the book and then reappears later on. I don't want to give the story away. But I have tried very hard to base Minnie's story on Olga's real-life story, the different parts of her spying life, which took 6 years out of her life, the comings and goings, the people she was spying on, who are all real-life historical figures, and have researched all the places that she went, from Paris to India, though she spent most of her time in London in rather down-at-heel offices, especially the office of the Communist Party in King Street, Covent Garden.
Well, you've mentioned the 6 years that Olga was a spy for. Was it usual for people to be a spy for such a relatively short period of time?
I don't know about usual. Each case was individual, I suppose, depending on matters such as how long they were required, perhaps how long the person they were spying on or the outfit they were spying on was available to them, for how long they were of interest. The people being spied on were actually of interest to MI5, whether they were uncovered or not, exposed or not. Minnie was not exposed for the whole of that 6 years, but there were some figures who were. The thing is, I suppose, if Olga had been the kind of spy who had been a woman of action, perhaps during wartime, it was very likely that her spying life might not have been all that long, because, she could have been captured and sent away to a concentration camp or just shot. So at least Olga was doing it in peacetime, and her spying life was in some ways much more humdrum and non-violent. This didn't mean that she didn't live in fear. She did live in fear, and she learnt very quickly from Max the sort of thing that did happen to spies who were exposed, and she didn't want to suffer the work of some secret poisoner or be carted away to Russia and dealt with. So she was very careful.
Well, I know it shouldn't be a spoiler, but near the end of the book, Minnie's meeting this man, and he notes about how hopefully, all the male spies will be able to do great things, and then he kind of says, and a woman or two. The way you've written it is an interesting thing in itself, that sentence. But it does make you wonder, were there many women spies in this period of time?
No, there weren't very many, but Maxwell Knight himself had a much clearer eye view of women, and he recognised their value in various ways. One of the ways was as secretaries, particularly. They were absolutely perfect to set in place doing office work. He also held that they were extremely good at observation and at recording their observations. And the sort of demand that he was making of his female spies was definitely not of the more highly coloured Mata Hari type who slept with the people they were spying on and were basically, femme fatale. He wanted his female spies to be quiet, to fit in, and to use their wits rather than personal attractions to extract information. So no, and certainly not in the popular culture. There was very little about female spies, apart from, as I say, the Mata Hari sort. No, spies were generally thought to be men of action.
Well, you say about the facts and fiction of Minnie's life, moving on to Minnie herself and your writing. Was it difficult to work with the facts and kind of add your fiction into the story?
Yes, in fact, I loved the freedom of the gaps in my knowledge, because that gave me the opportunity to invent in a way that fitted in with what I otherwise knew of Minnie and her times. And I particularly enjoyed writing those bits. So all the parts with the aforementioned Raymond, the ex-boyfriend, for instance, I particularly enjoyed writing because I could go to town over Raymond, create the kind of boyfriend I thought that she would likely have had, someone close to her from her home city of Birmingham, who knew some of the people she knew. They knew each other's families and so forth. So I could invent somebody who was completely believable, hopefully, as a partner for her. But also I could use him to illustrate the whole of the side of life that Minnie really sacrificed when she became a spy. Naturally, as we know about spies, she was not able to tell a soul. The only person who knew she was Max, and he became her absolute anchor in life. He was the only one that she could confide in and talk about her fears. And when she was with Raymond, she could be reminded of that other side of life, the side of life that she was, according to her mother, supposed to have had, to have got married and had a family of her own. And it was a source of tension in the book that I enjoyed writing, the fact that she was spending time with Raymond, but he had not got an inkling that she was a spy, and she couldn't tell him.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something that, after I finished the book particularly, seeing that obviously you had a side there that it could have been a thriller all about the plot, but there was just such a good balance here in your book of where you've got everything that's going on with her in her career, but then you have got that other side that's like the domestic side, I suppose, also in context of her being a woman in the period.
Yeah,
that was so good. And I am surprised actually in a way to find that Raymond is fictional, because he did come across incredibly real.
Thank you.
I kind of hope that she did have someone, and maybe we don't know about her.
It was said in various of the material that I looked at that there was a boyfriend at the period that I slotted Raymond in, but nothing was seemed to be known about him, who he was or the weight of his importance to her and so on. So I just built that side on the very small information.
It worked wonderfully. I'll leave that bit there. I won't say about the rest that I thought was good in this vein, because I don't want to spoil the book.
No, I don't want to spoil what happens.
Yes, yeah. I was going to ask about Max. You've introduced him. You said that he was an inspiration for James Bond. Was he an author in real life?
Yes, he was. He wrote 2 spy novels, at least 2 spy novels, which I described the first one in the book, and they weren't very good. And they were very much about his projection of himself. It was as if he was the central character, someone who was a good chap and jolly brave. But he tended to write with all this cod spying language, which was not very convincing to people who loved John Buchan, for instance. He didn't really meet the mark. But the thing about Maxwell Knight is that after he retired from MI5 in the 1940s, his love of animals came to the fore, and he started doing nature programs for the television and writing books about pets of all sizes and shapes. And he became a very well-known, popular figure in this field, in the way of somebody like Johnny Morris a generation later. So there are lots and lots of books about handling hamsters and training dogs and all that sort of thing. So he was a man of many parts. This certainly comes across in all that I've read about him for my novel. He was a man who compartmentalized all the different parts of his life. He had lots and lots of acquaintances, but I wonder how many actual deep friends he had, because he used to keep the sides of his life apart. And I imagine some people who knew him in one sphere didn't know that he also occupied all these other spheres as well. His marriages were all ultimately unsuccessful because I think he was not a man who really welcomed intimacy. And there are some people who think that he was homosexual, a repressed homosexual, and other people who don't. But he was not straightforward. Anything is probably the most accurate analysis.
Well, I really struggled to warm to him. I really did.
That's interesting, yes.
Yeah. Well, how did you, when you were writing, your fictionalized version of the story, and that, how did you expect readers might take to him?
I was hoping that people would sense that he was a very charming person, that he did have this kind of quality of almost being able hypnotically to win people over. It wasn't a sexual thing. It was about a projected warmth, if you like. But whether everybody who encountered him felt they could trust a person like that is one of the things that I wondered. And I think that Minnie came to wonder that as well. I think already in that section that I read you from quite early on in the book, it's apparent that she can't fully trust him because she only knows a little bit of her place in his world. She only occupies a small part of it. And there's all sorts of things she doesn't know. And she already feels quite early on that she's having to trust him blind, even though he's allowing her to misunderstand situations. So, for instance, she thinks she's going to his office or a training centre or whatever, and actually he's invited her to his flat, which she doesn't feel, as a young woman maybe a young woman now wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable going round to be trained in a man's flat.
It's almost like a mini study where you've got Minnie often wondering about this relationship she's got with Max. She says it's not romantic, it's nothing like that. And in with this, I wondered how much did Minnie's relationship with her father impact her choices in these spy years?
Right, well, I should start by explaining about her father. Minnie's father was the night editor of a newspaper that was based in Manchester for a certain part of her childhood. And the family was visited very early by tragedy, which is that Minnie was the second born in the family. And the firstborn was a boy called Edward. And when Edward was very young, around about 5, I believe, he was fatally injured in an accident at a fairground and died. After that, Minnie's father was so overtaken by grief that he turned to his second child and somehow subconsciously expected her to take Edward's place, to be able to have the same relationship as he had had with the young boy Edward, a father and son relationship. And initially, he really encouraged her to be a tomboy, but she wasn't Edward, and he became very frustrated with this. And then further children were born in the family. That included a pair of twin girls who were incredibly pretty with blonde hair and blue eyes, also more boys. And Minnie's father rather half rejected Minnie and said, well, why don't you look like these pretty little sisters? I think you should dress in pretty dresses and be properly feminine and this sort of thing. And their relationship became full of friction, and she felt she could never please him, whatever she did. He also began to be violent towards her when other people weren't looking. All this ended in the early years of the war, the First World War, when he was killed in action. And after this happened, obviously the whole family was struck by grief at his loss, but Minnie did not grieve in the same way as the others. And she tried to explain to her family that he hit her and that she didn't miss him. And they told her she was talking a lot of nonsense. They wouldn't believe her. So after that, her upbringing was not very happy. She was loved by her mother and the rest of her family very deeply, but somehow her ability to deal with children her own age at school and so forth was affected. She couldn't make close friends very easily. She used to do practical jokes and play up at school in order to get attention. She got expelled from one school. So by the time we first meet her in the novel, when she's in her early 20s and she's a secretary in Birmingham, she is this very conflicted young woman who doesn't find life straightforward, is sure that there must be something else out there. And I think a psychologist might say that part of this is to do with what had happened to her as a child, the way he had treated her. It's quite possibly an aspect of her that rang true with Max when he first interviewed her, because Max himself had had a very difficult childhood and a certain amount of rejection from parts of his own family. And it may be that he recognised something of himself in her. Who knows? That all happened to Olga. Yeah, the only thing I left with Olga's family, I had to do a certain amount of inventing as to the personalities of the relatives involved. And I might have invented the odd uncle who doesn't appear in the book. I did, however, leave out another family tragedy in which another of Olga's brothers was killed in a cycling accident, because I suppose I thought it was one tragedy too many for the novel. So I left that bit out. I don't know whether you would agree or not, but that's felt a comfortable thing to do, actually, because you can overload, you can up the ante too much, if you like, having somebody have too many tragedies in a novel.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you with that. Yeah, you can make people immune to things.
Yeah.
Which, in a way, is interesting when you're contrasting it with you saying that these things happened and you had to decide whether to keep them on or not, and of course they're real, which asks you to look into it more. She was a very strong person then, this Olga, definitely. Stronger than maybe we would think, even.
Yes, I think so. But it's a different sort of strength to the hairy-chested man of action strength. I think we can recognise the sort who have a great deal of stamina and loyalty, and who get on with the task that they've been given because they feel it's right to do it, that they're doing a good thing, and that it's important that they carry on, they plod on even when things are bad. And, you know, you don't just throw your toys out of the pram and give up on something because it's got difficult. But she really did believe that in her spying work, she was doing something that was patriotic and right, worthwhile. She was doing her duty, and she wasn't in it for the fame. And indeed, at the end of the book, when she does become a more well-known figure, albeit she's given anonymity in the press, she absolutely hates it and can't cope with it.
Try and keep this bit brief, I suppose. So I've got one question on it so that it's not too spoilerific. There's info online about the British Communist Party that was, but not about the Friends of the Soviet Union specifically. Are you able to tell us about them at all?
Yes. After the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik communists who come into power, we know a great deal about their brand of idealism, which is wanting to spread the communist revolution internationally. At the same time, with all the changes that have been going on in Russia, the development of 5-year economic plans and the suppression of the middle classes and the attempt to impose the communist experiment on the whole country, Russia was actually in a pretty bad way economically, and there was a lot of suffering. So on the one hand, the rest of the world were incredibly suspicious about Russian communism, but they were also very sympathetic to the suffering of ordinary people. As part of their attempts to export communist principles, Russian communists were setting up international networks to draw liberal or left-thinking people into the orbit of Russian communist thought. And they were also using these to attract funds and to educate people in the suffering in Russia. So the Friends of the Soviet Union was an organization that was designed in various countries, partly social, partly educational, partly fundraising group that advertised information about communist Russia. So there were films about it and talks, usually quite sort of upbeat about the communist experiment. And people who came and they joined the Friends of the Soviet Union had really no idea that it was a communist-backed organization. They thought that it was a sort of international friendship group, if you like, and they enjoyed the social side of it, fundraising dances, and there was weekend activities like hikes and that sort of thing. So it was just one of those typical social groups that we associate with the 1920s and 30s. So the Friends of the Soviet Union are a sort of forgotten part of communist history now, and I dare say it would be possible to eventually find their archives and see what they got up to, but it would all have appeared rather well-meaning and not very suspicious at all.
Well, it was really difficult not to like some of these people a heck of a lot.
Yeah, and that was what Olga / Minnie found too, that not every communist in the country was some evil revolutionary who wanted to deal with violent revolution.
I wondered if it was something that you brought in as a mini focus almost to reconsider things as a reader and kind of think more about these people, rather than them as a group sort of thing. Or
Yes. Well, it was one of the many complexities of her situation as a spy. She was a genuinely lonely figure in that she was their friend. She went out to lunch with them. She spent time with them in the office. She admired some of the things they were doing and so forth. But all the time, she would betray them tomorrow. So it wasn't a nice feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got to stay with that for spoilers. There's lots more questions I could ask, but let's stay there. What's next in terms of your books and your writing?
Okay, yeah. Well, the book I've just submitted to my publishers is completely imaginary. So there are no, there might be sort of one very minor person who was a real life person. I've gone back to the Second World War, and there are two narratives in it. One of the narratives is set in Norfolk and the other in occupied France. I don't want to say too much about it because it's still in construction in some ways. I've got to do some rewriting, but it again feels something slightly different for me because writing books that are entirely historical is something that I haven't done very much, and just the structure of it is something different from what I've done before. I always like to set myself some challenge or other rather than feeling I'm rewriting the same book.
Yeah, so sort of on the note of the facts and things, I've noted that you prefer not to use real life figures so much because of the difficulties and making a story from a real person and such. But do you think you might do similar again?
If I were to read about somebody who really inspired me in that way, then yes. It was a sort of serendipity that I came across the real life story of Olga Gray. I was actually looking for something else, researching a situation for the Second World War that I could use as a backstory for a completely different kind of novel. And it was just that while doing this research, I came across Olga's story, and it just gripped me so much that I completely dropped my plans for the other novel and just concentrated on writing about her. Now, if something like that happened again, then yes, I might be possessed to write about a real life figure. But it was a first to me, and I found it quite stressful because of, I suppose, all the ethical side of not wanting to misrepresent somebody's real life story. But also, I find it much easier to inhabit fictional characters. I can imagine that I'm them in my writing, and it helps very much to call Olga Minnie. It's not wanting to misrepresent them.
No, I totally understand that. I mean, you called your character Minnie, but do you feel you did right by Olga?
Well, on the whole, I do, yes. And I felt much better since I was contacted by Olga's granddaughter, and she said that she had heard about the book and that she and her mother, Olga's daughter, were listening to the audio version and they were really loving it, and it made them think about their mother and appreciate new things about her and so on. Olga herself died around about 1990, but I was so thrilled to hear this endorsement from her descendants and feel that I'd done something for them, I suppose.
No, that's fantastic. So, listeners, links to purchase A Beautiful Spy are in the episode description. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider reviewing the show. You can do this on Apple Podcasts, the Podcast Addict site, or on the Podchaser website. I'll include links. Do also review any other podcasts you listen to. The feedback is really useful to the creators. Rachel, this has been fabulous having you here today. The amount of knowledge that you have shared with us, and also, of course, in your book, and just that bit there that you've ended on, that the family of Olga have read your book and been happy with it. That was lovely to hear. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. There's some great questions that you've asked.
The next interview will be on Monday, the 23rd of August. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 43, was recorded on the 30th of July and published on the 9th of August, 2021. Music and production by Charlie Place.